Hello everybody, this is Hammer Striker here. Today I'm going to do kind of a flashback to the 80s, which is over 40 years ago, at the guns that were available back then for concealed carry, personal defense, and, well, the Desert Eagle that I've got here wasn't a concealed carry, still isn't a concealed carry, but it's on here simply because I need to recognize that the 80s brought us this movie icon and behemoth. So this is the Desert Eagle in 50 AE. Now it's important to note that as I go through these, not every one of these that's on the table was actually made in the 80s. They're meant to represent ones that would have been made in the 80s. I don't have a lot of 80s guns. They were treated like tools, and a lot of them don't exist anymore. So some of the things that were used in the 80s that weren't actually made or invented in the 80s would be things like in 1911. These would still very popular for concealed carry. They were made in a number of different flavors. You had the government model, and of course you had a lot of fancy stainless steel versions like this. So these were used in the 80s even though they were invented well before the 80s. Another example of something that was used in the 80s would have been the Beretta 92. Yes, this is an M9A3, but it would have been a Beretta 92 at the time. They were fairly popular for personal defense in the 80s. Things that actually came into existence in the 80s are things like this SIG P226. These were invented in the 80s, became popular in the 80s, were used by various militaries. So far you look, and most of the things I'm picking up are big. They're heavy, they're metal. Things like this CZ75 existed before the 80s, but it's a big, heavy one. And I'll also note that there's not any revolvers in this or derringers in this, simply because it would get too big. There'd be way too many guns on the table. Focusing just on semi-automatics, because concealed carry has pretty much always kind of evolved towards semi-automatics, capacity, speed of reload. This Browning High Power, this is actually an older Browning High Power. These were not invented in the 80s, but they were very popular in the 80s. They were high capacity, semi-automatic for the day. Now if you move away from high capacity and go more towards small and light, the Walther PP series, this is a PPKS, these were available in assorted different calibers. And these would have been your deep concealed guns of the day, which is really a marked difference between what we would consider deep concealed today, or pocket or shoulder or other type of carry. This is what that looked like back then. Then the Disruptor. Glock invented the 17. Now this is a P80. The reason I've got this out is because it's a good representation. It's a Glock replica of what the 17 was. So it had this really smooth pebble grip. This was actually kind of thought to be very slippery and hard to get a hold of. To get an original unmodified Glock 17 right now is pretty difficult. But this is what your Glock 17 basically would have looked like. These disrupted a lot of things. They were polymer pistols. At the time, there was a big outcry that airport metal detectors wouldn't be able to detect these, which we all know to be very untrue, but laws were passed because this thing came into existence. That really kind of disrupted not only carry, but actually a lot of other legalities associated with it. And then the Delta Elite, the Colt Delta Elite in 10mm, which today we look at as a caliber that's just been around. Well, it was emerging in the 80s, and the Delta Elite was one of the popular guns that was chambered in it. Trying to get it where it doesn't glare so you can actually see the thing. These are just beautiful, and they're a pleasure to shoot. Other things you would have had is like the Bursa 383. Yeah, I know this is a Thunder Plus, but the 383 would have looked something like this, been roughly the same size as this. And this would have been another metal, more deep conceal shoulder or pocket type gun, which is vastly different than what we would call a pocket gun. And then this Smith & Wesson 5903. This is actually an older one that's been around. This is actually it's been a service pistol. It was a law enforcement trade-in. But this became really popular in the movies. They've kind of got a nice footprint. They just look cool. Most of them are all metal. They do have a couple different variations of them. But that was a kind of a popular gun at the time, and if I'm remembering correctly, they were fairly reasonably priced comparatively. So So by far not to be meant to be a comprehensive everything that existed, just kind of a selection, just to kind of show what it looked like then versus, of course, you can look at your own armory and look to see what things look like today. But beyond that, if you like our videos, please give us a thumbs up, share, subscribe, click that bell to be notified if you do. Check us out on Facebook, Instagram, Player, Rumble, or pretty much everywhere. And thank you.